Welcome back to Responsibly Unhinged, second week of the row. I don't want to brag, but we're back at it. I was just saying this in the last episode too, that every time I have a guest on here, I'm like so excited because I'm really bad at being consistent with this podcast. And then I get an ego when I have like a few in a row and then I disappear for a month again. But every time I do it, I at least bring back somebody good. And I have another great guest for you guys today. My friend Greg Phelps is here, fellow comedian, but I'll let him say a little bit more about himself. Greg, how are you and who are you?
Thank you so much for having me, Kylie. I'm doing well. I am a comedian in Austin, Texas. Let's see, what else do you want to know about me? We've talked about how I'm in grad school to become a counselor. I used to work in tech, and I work a office job where I restock the kitchens, essentially. And yeah, I guess I'm a personality nerd, so we're going to talk about some personality science today.
Yeah, I'm excited about that. I love personality analysis.
Yeah, me too.
I always like to start out when I brought on I think now like the fourth comic I've gotten to have on. And I'm always curious. It feels like the small talk when we're in comedy settings, but I found that non-comedy audiences are always intrigued as well. How did you get into this whole shebang? Like, because you have background beyond stand-up. You've done more with that when it comes to comedy, acting, and things like that. So what's kind of your backstory with performing and just comedy in general? And like, how did you kind of dive into what you're doing now?
Yeah, I started doing my first comedy experience was improv. So when I was a senior in high school, I was working in a grocery store, and one of my coworkers was like, "You're kind of funny, but you could use some training. Come to improv rehearsals with us." So I started going to the local college group. They had these like open improv tryouts you could do. Went to those for like a year, learned short form improv. Then I went to college at a different place and learned long form improv and was in the performing group there and did, like hundreds of improv shows over the course of 4 years. And we did like festivals and stuff. Many of those took us to Chicago. And so I ended up I did a little stint in Seattle for about 2 years where I performed with Jet City Improv, did mostly short form there, a long form show or two, and then moved to Chicago, did improv and sketch there. And I learned, took classes at a few different theaters there, did some sketch shows, did some scripted theater, like comedic musical there at the Annoyance. And I started dabbling in posting online videos during the pandemic and just started doing TikTok stuff. I also had a brief little phase where I was making web comics.
Oh, fun.
And then as soon as I started having videos go viral on TikTok, I got really bored of drawing because drawing takes so long, and I'm not good at it, so I would just hit undo until it looked the way I wanted. Yeah, then I was dabbling in stand up when I lived in Chicago and a little bit in college, but I'd really only done it a handful of times. I wasn't really seriously like going to the mics until I moved to Austin, and yeah, started doing stand up pretty seriously. And now I'm mostly doing stand up, but I'm getting back into improv. So that's my journey.
Yeah, and you do a lot with like sketch writing outside of the viral scene as well, right? Like you've done some sketch shows here, you've like helped write, and you're writing a show now, right?
Yeah,
writing.
I performed in a show that two other people had written, and now the same two people and I are co-writing a show that we're going to put up at the Fallout aiming for October.
Cool.
Kind of like a Halloween themed sketch
Yeah,
show.
that'll be fun.
Yeah.
And you're teaching improv now as well.
Yeah, cool. I'm teaching Improv 101, the Fallout, which is super fun.
Super fun. We have a stand-in producer, Justine, here today, and she is taking the improv class, so she can give you later episode feedback on how that's going.
Incredible. Give me teaching feedback.
Teaching feedback. Do they have like, when I was teaching college, we had like a ratemyprofessor.com. And I used to, I like had forgotten this long memory, and I forget who I was with recently. Just some people I'd randomly met, and we were talking about how I used to teach, and they like went and looked it up, and I had like forgotten about this for years, and they went and found like all my student reviews. Oh, wow. And it was really funny because they also have like a chili pepper scale. So they let you also rate your professor's attractiveness. And I was doing this when I was like 24. So it was really funny to go back down there and like read it. And it was super funny because I had like mostly good reviews. And then like one person that was just like very disorganized, talks too fast, all this stuff. And I was like, all of that is true. But this is also definitely by the username somebody I failed.
Yeah.
So,
Well, at least they thought you were hot. So.
yeah, I at least had like a 4 out of 5, which I'll take. So
Nothing's hotter than like a professor that's really knowledgeable and handsome. And you're
obviously,
like, I guess unless also if they're like if they're a parent too.
if they're a parent,
father, like a hot professor,
like a single dad,
who's very smart, a little bit sad.
Yeah, well, we know I love a sad man.
Yeah.
Personally. Something else that Greg and I talk about a lot is my terrible taste in men. So
I it's growing on me. I don't think I don't want to be too unkind, but when you first showed me some pictures of guys who were interested, and I was like, oh God, all these men look like they need therapy.
Which is true.
Yeah.
So, Carly, my guest last week that y'all got to hear, and I talked about this for a little while where I like brought up my type and she just immediately was like, no. And I was like, bitch, your type also sucks. Like, so it's just funny because everybody's unique thing. I think that's actually really cool. And I know we've talked about this in terms of like, I think attraction is just so dependent on the person. Like, it's so funny and how we all like get so in our heads about whether we are attractive or not. Cause it's like, there's really, like, of course there are like, I think people who are just like stereotypically attractive, like, everyone can look at like Ryan Reynolds and be like, that's a handsome guy. Right. But like other things, it's like, it really just depends on what you're into. And so I know like Justine and I were at a bar having this conversation before. We were just like, why do we all get so self-conscious when it's like, this person may not find you attractive, but somebody else, you might be like the hottest person they've ever seen. Like, you know what I mean? The type of guys that like you and I both like, or like would never be attracted to them, but we like, that's what we pursue.
Yeah.
And I think we should all take that as a better like self-love lesson, honestly.
I had a friend in Chicago who was kind of like my drinking buddy because we had like the identical taste in men, so we'd go to the same gay bars where that kind of person would show up. But it was kind of like a rivalry almost because we would be after the same guy, and I think there'd have to be a moment where we look at each other and be like, no, you go,
Yeah.
go introduce yourself, or like I'll wingman you or whatever. We also looked pretty similar too, so it was pretty conceivable that like we could be chasing after the same person.
That's fun.
Yeah, it didn't really make for a great long-term friendship, but
yeah, I often joke about that it's actually like me and my friends all roast each other, but it's actually like a low-key secret to your friendships is like having not the same type of men because you're never going to be pursuing the same dudes.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
nice.
Yeah, like most gay guys are after like there are many of my gay friends are after like this traditional like, oh, I want a guy that's ripped and has a six-pack, and I'm like, I want the aloof, goofy, maybe more heavy set comedic relief.
Yeah.
It's always my crush was the bigger goofy guy, and so my friends were like, great.
Yeah, like you've said it before, like the Seth Rogen or like whatever in the film kind of characters, right?
Seth Rogen was an early crush.
Yeah.
Even like George Costanza, I guess. Although finally, like the TikTok generation is waking up to the dreamboat of that archetype.
I appreciate the internet awakening of people realizing that like Jason Segel is somebody we should chase after. I've always had a crush on him, which tells me too. Like that's something with like stereotypically, he's not an ugly guy, but not a super attractive guy, but it's like his persona is so attractive.
Well, I was always into like Chris Pratt when he was on Parks and Rec.
Yeah.
And then when he got ripped for the Jurassic Park movies or whatever, suddenly people were like, wow, I'm like, I had that one. I had that one early.
Yeah, you were like way before he was hot. I thought he was hot.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's fun. No, it is cool though. What do you feel like, just circling back a little bit with the diverse experience you have, versatile king of comedy over here. Do you have a place that you feel like is more your like where you see yourself long-term focusing, or do you see yourself really liking to stay kind of pretty equally spread?
I currently I'm really enjoying getting better at stand-up. It's such a fun and different experience because you're just like the one person on stage and getting to interact directly with the audience instead of having the fourth wall like in sketch or theater. I think long term, I really do like having digital sketches filmed, and like a dream job would be to work on a sketch show like I Think You Should Leave, or early comedy heroes for me was like Tim and Eric from Tim and Eric Awesome Show, great job. And that's a show where if somebody's into that show, I'm like, oh, our senses of humor are probably similar. So yeah, I think the dream would be to like have a TV show, sketch show or something, or even just having like a YouTube channel that we could monetize putting out sketches. But I would still want to be doing stand up in some capacity. And I think I do have like acting dreams as well.
Yeah.
They come with that. So like people like Jim Carrey stand out in my mind as a really cool career path where they like were doing, I believe he was doing stand up. I got I gotta I don't actually know like what the proper evolution of his career was, but at some point he got into acting and now he has some of the best dramatic films. Like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind is one of my all-time favorite movies, and it's a serious film and he acts the shit out of it, but he brings that like comedy into his acting in subtle ways.
I don't know if I knew Jim Carrey did stand up, actually.
I thought he did, but I could be.
You could be totally right. Like I said,
I thought he did it early in his career, but I might be wrong.
I wouldn't be surprised.
I swear, yeah, I might be mixing him up with like Robin Williams.
Yeah, who also I didn't know until like much later in life that he did stand up either, because that was early for him as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, those are both people though who are just like, you can tell, just like such complex individuals and had like such versatile experience too. So I can see that.
Yeah.
Aligning with you.
Yeah. What about you? Same question.
Yeah, I don't have like a diverse experience in those other realms, but I definitely see stand up as it. Like when I talk about, I would love, like, if I guess I could allude to like podcasting in this, it would be amazing for like the podcast to pick up like, you know, sponsors and have something that'd be a bigger show. Like, I think that's really cool. My favorite podcaster just recently got into where she's big enough to do like the live shows for her podcast and tours for that. And I think that would be really cool.
Yeah.
But definitely like on the path of wanting to do stand up as like the thing. As you know, I'm versatile in like the other realm, just like I've had a lot of career things that I've done and a lot of places I could take myself, I think, but this feels the most like where I'm the most authentically myself and the most comfortable, and where like I think what I've experienced so far being pretty fresh meat has been like affirming enough for me to feel like, okay, like it's exciting for me to think about like people we meet all the time, right? That are doing this like 3, 4, 5 years and stuff, and how they're so developed and stuff. And I think about like where I'm at now and like in just 2 years from now, like how much better I could be. And that's like pretty exciting to me.
Yeah. I was just having a green room conversation with another comic a few days ago. And I think he'd been doing it for like 15 years. And I mentioned that it's sometimes frustrating. Almost, I have this impatience. I'm like, man, I wish I could just fast forward a few years to where I'm really good at this, because I know how much hard work I'm gonna have to keep putting in to get there. But I keep reminding myself to like enjoy the journey, and every show I do, I try to like have gratitude for it and be like, don't worry, eventually my material will match that the taste that I have for it. You know, like Ira Glass's quote about you have good tastes, and then when you start doing the arts, your art is going to be worse than where your taste level is at, and eventually you get up to that point, but it takes a lot of work. So it's hard, but I'm trusting the journey and trusting the path. Yeah, it's definitely something. I was having this conversation with the comic when we were waiting for Tony a week or two ago also, about like it's really easy to like look around and see people, because there's so many people here who are like killing it, right, and like getting all these crazy opportunities, and it's really hard to not have that like comparison syndrome. And I do the same thing where I try to I take myself back, and I was like kind of telling him that I'm like, you get in your head that way, but I'm constantly always like, I've been doing this not even a full year, and so it's like I don't have any expectation that those things should be happening to me. And so if I get anything even relatively close to that, that's cool, that happens, is like just I take it as like like you said, it's like a gratitude and like just a sign that I should keep working for this, rather than being like, oh, why am I not on 4 shows a night every weekend? Like, you know what I mean? It's like, instead I'm like, okay, I'm really happy to have like one spot, because there are comics here who have been doing it longer, or people who are in this space that like, they might have 1 spot a month, you know? So if I have like 3 spots in a month, like I'm like, that's still something to be excited about. Totally. Yeah. I try to be super grateful, because I definitely have met open micers who have been grinding for way longer than me. Although I will say, if I factor in like all the years I spent doing other forms of comedy, I guess technically I've been performing longer than a lot of people, but stand up itself, you know, is a different beast. So anytime somebody reaches, and it has only happened a few times, but the few times somebody's reached out to me cold and asked me to be on a show, like a person I don't know, I'm just like, oh my God, thank you so much. I try not to come off too crazy, but I'm like, thank you so much. Yes, I can be there. I'll be there early. I'll be there the day before. I like show up with donuts. No, I get that. And I think that that's a good way to be, honestly. Like, I think staying positive about your potential while still being humble about it is like a really good spot. Cause I think it's really easy to get jaded in industries like this too. And to just like stay genuine and like excited about your opportunities, I think is going to carry
both of us to a good place. Like that's, you know, I think you've experienced this. I know I have, like, people that are generally tend to be surprised by like how long you've been doing it. And I take that as like the biggest compliment, honestly.
I know, I love that when you tell someone how long you've been doing it, like, oh, really? Wow, only that long?
Yeah, it's like the best
Thank
feeling.
you so
Oh my
much.
gosh. But to your point, it's like you're not factoring in the years of all the other stuff you've done. And even for me outside of comedy, it's like I always try to, and I'm trying to get out of this where I like rationalize why I'm doing well, or feeling like I need to like explain myself. I don't know, it's like this weird where I'm like, oh, but I had like this, and this, but I don't know if that's just like, I don't know if it's even negative, maybe.
I get in my head about it. I'm like, is this false modesty? What's
Yeah.
going on? Am I being a, garbage person or
Yeah.
something? Like I always think of my, one of my parents is very devout and has all sorts of like sage wisdom about morality and stuff. And
Yeah.
I mean, some of it wasn't good because when I was young, they were like a little anti-gay or very anti-gay, but some of those morality lessons about like doing good deeds and not bragging about them and stuff always floats in my head. And I'm like, oh right, I need to make sure I'm not being a prick and like being gracious and at least trying to be somewhat humble. And of course, as soon as you start talking about trying to be humble, you're instantly less humble. So it's a trip.
I know. I think that I always try to do it because sometimes I think I feel awkward when people who have done it a long time are the ones that like give me that compliment. And then I feel the need to be like, oh, well, I have this like background in writing, like I've written my whole life. I have experience being in front of people and speaking and stuff like that. And I'm like, I do think that plays into like why I've had like an easier just like transition into it than maybe other people when they first started.
But some people start stand up and never done any performance. That to me seems so scary.
Yeah, and that's very admirable. Like there's like kind of winging it and like going for it and like to develop like that is really cool. So yeah, I kind of always try to say that I think as like oh, well, this is like why it's going well for me. It's not because I just like came out of nowhere and like could do it okay, so
maybe we both need to work on accepting compliments, just being like, thank you so much.
Yeah. I do always feel like I have to go down this rabbit hole being like, well, it's because and like I could just be like, thank you. Because it's almost just as bad as like I have gotten better at not like deflecting compliments and being like, oh no, like I have so much work to do and but like I've gotten past that, but then it's kind of just went the other direction. So it's like maybe I just thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Similarly, my mom recently gave me the advice of like things that I don't want in my life, how simple it is to just be able to be like, no, thank you to people for things like even just like interactions with people. She was like telling me she was teaching my nieces that like if someone like approaches you or wants to like, play with you or do something you don't want to do, you can just simply be like, no, thank you. And she was like, I feel like that's something we need to like teach adults too. Like if it's like someone that's like texting you don't want to be talking to, or like they're trying to hang out with you rather than trying to have all these like excuses or like explain your boundaries, just be like, no, thanks.
That gets into like assertiveness and agreeableness. I think you took the big 5 personality test. Maybe it's a good transition into that. You and I both are very high in agreeableness. The trait agreeableness, the opposite of that is disagreeableness. And as somebody who's highly agreeable, I struggle with setting boundaries and saying no. And so the best way to work on that is practicing assertiveness skills, which is very much assertiveness being like that blend. It's right in the middle of like being aggressive and being confident. I'm messing with the scale. It's like more being confident and standing up for your boundaries in a way that's not judging others and not being mean or aggressive, but it's just saying like, here's what I want. Here's my limit. Being like, hey, sorry, I don't really want to talk or hang out. I'm busy or I'm not feeling it.
Yeah.
You probably do this too, where I feel compelled to give excuses when I really could just be like, hey, sorry, I'm not feeling it.
Yeah. Rather than having to explain why or be like, oh, I have this and this and
and I think a lot of people have models of behavior that's like in aggressiveness instead of assertiveness. And you don't always have to be like, don't do that. Like, hey, I'd like if you don't do that. Very different. But if you're too agreeable, you're like, no, it's okay. Actually, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you're doing that thing.
That's where I tend to fall, which is probably so the agreeableness.
It's terrible.
I'm so sorry that you were an asshole.
It's why when you think of somebody in your life who you're like, Oh, I love hanging out with them because they tell it like it is.
Oh yeah.
Those people are usually really low in agreeableness,
Hmm.
or not too low in it, but like they're lower than average, and will just be like, I don't like that, or it was terrible, or
Yeah.
and it's so refreshing because we're surrounded by this agreeableness cult. And when people are actually honest about stuff, but not in a mean way, just like honest, like, yeah, I didn't like it, wasn't for me. It's
Yeah.
so refreshing.
Yeah.
If you make your friend a lunch, like, I didn't like it, it was too much mayonnaise. Like, oh, thanks for being honest, and not
Yeah.
just like forcing it down. And,
Yeah.
no, it was fine. Like, no, now I actually have honest data that I can use to deepen our friendship.
Yeah. If you can approach it from like like you said, it's like bordering that line of like not being aggressive, but just being able to be honest, like that is going to help the other person way more.
Absolutely.
And yeah, Carly and I on last week's episode kind of talked about this a little bit too, because like her personality is more like that. And I was telling her that I was like, it's funny because I've actually found it throughout my life. I've attracted a lot of people who are like that. And I think there's like this thing, someone told it to me in like relationship setting, but I think it applies to friendships, is we tend to like not necessarily opposites attract, but more so like you attract what you feel like you lack, or like where you have areas for growth. Like it's like you have something to learn from each other. And I have people like her, like Justine is a little better at that than me. Like my friend Jasmine that you've met, like there are more people who are like more firm and just like now, like, if some things are like telling people kind of straight up how things are. And I found it funny that I spend so much time with people like that, and I'm not like that, but I have grown to be more like that than I used to be. And I think there's a reason I attract those types of people. And then of course I attract people who are on the same level of agreeableness too, because then like, we have this level of like empathy and understanding of like, it's nice to be able to like talk to you about stuff and like you'd be like, no, I would react that same way, and having that balance in your relationships is cool.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. But I would love for you to kind of share more about what this Big Five test is. We were kind of talking about it a little bit before the podcast, and we mentioned we're both like personality testing nerds. So I think a lot of people are familiar with like Myers-Briggs and Enneagrams, and or even like astrology or Harry Potter houses, whatever it is you want to go into.
Yeah.
And this is one that I had not heard of actually until you mentioned it for the podcast. So I would love for you to kind of talk about what it is, what it measures, and then we can kind of get into it.
Yeah, I learned about it a few years ago when I started getting into psychology a lot more and going down this track of like thinking I would make a good counselor and getting into grad school and stuff. So there's a lot of personality tests you can take. We all have heard of the Myers-Briggs. We know things like astrology and Enneagram and all these things. Many of them are really useful, but a lot of them are not scientifically like very valid in certain ways. And the way that you assess validity is like, if the same person retook the test a few weeks later, would they get the same score, or would it be different? Myers-Briggs, for example, is notorious where if you take it a few months later, a lot of people get different results. So that suggests that one's maybe not as deep in its conceptual construction of personality or whatever. Also, Myers-Briggs puts you into one of 16 categories instead of giving you a score on all the individual traits. So you kind of just get grouped in with something instead of having like a deeper individual score. Big Five, I think it's been around since the 90s. And is continuing being improved. And there's now a newer version that added an additional trait, which I think is honesty. But it's been very deeply studied. It's like highly cited in the literature. And I find it really helpful because you have 5 traits. The acronym is OCEAN: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And the first 4 traits are generally considered like good or neutral, and then neuroticism is kind of the only one that's like more negative,
which was very high on mine.
Yeah, we'll get into that.
Yeah,
and I kind of suspected yours was, and mine's also higher than average in neuroticism. Yeah, it's really helpful to understand because since you get a score in each one, you can understand how the traits interact with each other. So openness is pretty self-descriptive, how open you are to new experiences. People that are a little more closed off, they're like, oh, I would never go skydiving, they're probably lower in it. Conscientiousness is generally it's kind of like, it's thought of as like the hard work trait, or like how orderly you are. So like, do you keep a clean house? Do you get up and like say, yeah, I'm gonna kick my own butt and go to the gym? Do you keep a calendar and stuff? That's sort of conscientiousness. Extroversion is like how social you are. obviously the opposite is like introversion. How much time do you want to spend around people? Does your battery get depleted or re-energized being around people? How sociable are you?
That's my highest one.
And agreeableness, as we just talked about, how likely you are to go with the flow or cave to other people's needs, or how likely you are to like disrupt the social norm, to be like, actually, I don't like this, or I disagree with your idea, whatever. And then neuroticism is generally your experience of negative emotions. And that each of those 5 kind of break down into a bunch of sub traits. But talking about in general is really useful. So your score, do you want to talk about your score?
Yeah. So my 2 highest are tied. So I have 97 on extroversion and openness to experience, 91 on agreeableness, and then 81 neuroticism, 78 conscientiousness.
Yeah, so you're pretty high in all of them, above average in all of them. I'm a pretty similar personality type, except I might be a little lower on neuroticism and definitely lower on conscientiousness. I think I'm below average for the average male on conscientiousness, and I'm above average on than the average male on neuroticism. So we're kind of similar. I'm also very high in extroversion, openness, and agreeableness. I think my agreeableness and openness is in like the 98th or 99th percentile, as opposed to like the Myers-Briggs, which says like, oh, you're this, you're generally likable and, you know, get along with people, whatever. This helps you understand how they interrelate. For example, I'm highly extroverted, but I'm also more neurotic than the average person. So I experience negative emotions more. So like I'm nervous at a party if I don't know a lot of people.
Even though you can navigate it well?
Yeah. So I'm highly extroverted. I love being around people and they really fill me up. But my neuroticism sometimes gets in the way of that. So I'm like worrying if the vibes are bad, or you know, worrying about like making a social faux pas. I get really in my head about it. I'm also really agreeable, so I can like try to go with the flow and calm my nerves a bit. But when I warm up to people, suddenly I can be like the life of the party and be, you know, the one dancing and being like, let's do a cake stand or whatever. I've never done one of those, but I have. When I was 17. There we go. So yeah, it's interesting to look at the correlation between them. Like I'm really high in openness, which generally I think kind of correlates to a lot of like creative people. Like if you want to create art and you're really high in openness, you know, you're generally like, oh, I want to try a new hobby, try new things, try out a creative passion. But if you're lower in conscientiousness, you often are finding yourself kicking yourself, being like, why am I procrastinating so much? I have less of that, like what's sometimes called like grit, getting down and doing the work. So it's great that you're higher in conscientiousness, because that is really required. And you grind, like you go to the mics regularly and work on material and stuff. When I'm left to my lesser angels, I procrastinate a lot, and I really care about the outcome being good, but sometimes I can't motivate myself to put in some of the hard work. So
some of the questions regarding that I found a little hard to answer too, because like I struggle a lot with basically exactly what you're just talking about. Is I'm a hardworking person, but sometimes I struggle to do hard work, if that makes sense. Like I have a lot of issues with like getting going on a task, and like I procrastinate pretty terribly. We've talked about this. I have a general, like, I don't like, not necessarily diagnosed, but I have a lot of like ADD like symptoms, but also like taking it was interesting. Like if I would have taken the test a couple years ago, being different, like since basically going through certain like experiences I've been through, I think have changed things. Like if I would have taken this while I was like in my era of running my business and bodybuilding, I think my like conscientiousness would have been much higher. Because I was very rigid. I got up at this time, I did all those things, I had to like have a very managed schedule, and now like just the lifestyle I have doesn't really blend to that as much. And so that was kind of interesting to answer, but I tried to kind of think about myself like as a whole. But I think that's where maybe it wasn't as high, as I tried to be a little more honest, or answered a little more in the middle on some of those, because it was things like keeping a tidy space. You mentioned like I'm not someone who like lives in slob, but I'm not someone who like is like anal about keeping things clean immediately. Right. So it's like something like that. It was a little more hard for me to pick like a hard answer. But I did like that this broke down kind of like what you're saying too, like each of those things into those like subcategories you were talking about, like the neuroticism. I think generally when we hear someone being called neurotic, it does have a negative connotation, and reading the way,
sexist too.
So women are generally called neurotic a lot, right?
And one of the controversial things, or I guess one of the harder things for some people that are new to this to palate, is that there are like average differences between men and women in these traits, and they're not huge. There's more overlap than difference, but like on average, the average woman is slightly higher in neuroticism, and I think also slightly higher in agreeableness, which you can instantly conjure up reasons why that may be and societal ramifications of that. It's like, you know, the average woman is much less likely to get in a fight at the bar because if somebody bumped into them. But also is a little more likely to be like, hey, let's care about hygiene a little more because we don't want to get sick. And if you look at like evolutionary psychology, you could see why, like, it doesn't matter if some of the guys in the tribe get sick and die because it only takes one living male to repopulate. But like if the pregnant woman dies, that's, you know, that's a huge loss. So you could understand how like some of these differences might have emerged long ago because it was actually like really critical for the survival of the species for women to be like a little cleaner and a little bit more wary of danger. And it was actually rewarded for men in some ways to like, let's go hunt down that big ass animal. Yeah, one of us might die, but whatever. So and evolutionary theory and evolutionary psychology is you know, very theoretical, so I hesitate to be like that's definitely why it happened, but it makes sense. When I started learning more about this, I was like, that explains a lot of trends and my conceptualization of the universe, and more importantly, it helped me understand myself. So actually taking this test a few years ago for the first time was actually like so therapeutic to me because I understood, like I just explained about my neuroticism and extroversion. I used to think I was an introvert for years, and I realized, no, I'm just really socially anxious.
Yeah. And that's something that's interesting because I always, so even when I did like Enneagram testing, I remember I initially tested type 6 and a lot of that resonated with me, but then I would always have like people who were surprised by that because I am a very like socially forward person. I'm not really like I don't appear to be not confident. I don't have trouble navigating social settings. I'm very good at meeting people, making friends and stuff, but I always explain that I'm like, the type 6 stuff or like the neuroticism category of this is like what's going on in my inner dialogue. Like when I'm at home, it doesn't really affect how I interact with people, but it's affecting how I'm processing the interaction. And then I retested from a friend who's like very into Enneagram, and she sent me like a better test, and it did like the 6-wing 7. And like I realized like very socially I present as a 7, and it also like encompasses more of like I think the stuff on here that would be like open to experience, extrovert type things. And I agree, this test really like showed that kind of like duality of my personality better. And I like that, like I said, they broke down these things too, because I think a lot of times, like I said, the negative connotation neuroticism tends to be, for a lot of people, I think like if you call someone neurotic, they're like synonyms for that would be like spastic or anal or like like things like that. And I don't really like feel like I put that out a lot, but like they broke it down on here into anxiety, anger, depression, self-consciousness, immoderation, and vulnerability. And I really like that like scale. And what it showed me, mine were the highest was immoderation and anxiety. And the immoderation was interesting too, because that was something I had to like think about too, like outside of like, okay, when I was in this, but like a lot of the questions about that had more to do with like strong impulses and like if you're like more of an impulsive person, or you give into like cravings about things. And you know, it's kind of that like teetering line of just having that little bit of like chaos, I kind of felt like. And so that was interesting, because I think sometimes neurotic, you expect those people to be very like rigid, and it's actually kind of saying the opposite. Like this is more someone who just like acts kind of out.
Right. And that's part of why the sub traits are useful, because you might have somebody that's really high in anxiety, but they're also really low in immoderation. So they might be super rigid. So their average higher level score of neuroticism is maybe lower, but if you dove into the sub traits, you're like, oh, okay, there are certain sub traits that you are really high in. I think there's a sub trait in agreeableness, I believe. It's one where please pause.
Trust.
Yeah, there's like altruism, cooperation, modesty, sympathy. So you can think of like some people might be willing to cooperate, but they have less sympathy. Like I'll help you, but I don't really.
Yeah, there were a lot of questions about like how you view like needy people or less fortunate people, or like just like socially, like empathy and things like that. And that was really interesting too.
Yeah. Another good one is like orderliness versus cautiousness and self-discipline and conscientiousness. So like I'm pretty orderly. I have a schedule. I keep my house pretty clean. I'm really pride myself in always being on time or early to things. But I have a worse time with self-discipline. But because I'm such an extrovert, when I have social stakes attached to something, I am way more likely to be disciplined.
Yeah.
Because I'm, kind of a people pleaser and just love energy from people. So that's part of what's helpful of this from this personality test is that you can, if you have goals in your life, you can kind of understand like, okay, well, if I know that this is one of my weaknesses, here's how I could change the circumstances surrounding something and try to find better motivators to get something. For me, if I'm working on creative projects, I really like to get other people involved. And I know with stand-up, you kind of just have to learn to grind yourself.
Right.
But if you have a show buddy, you're like, hey, let's be mic buddies. Like when we met.
Super helpful.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's someone to just get you out of if you're kind of in that slump. It's like, hey, I'm going to this, and it's more motivating. Like, okay, I'm gonna have somebody there to talk to, and like.
And I think that gets into neuroticism too, where mics make me nervous. So if I have a buddy there and it's a more of a fun social experience, then I'm able to be less nervous and neurotic about it and lean into the other traits. So generally recommend everybody take the Big 5 test.
Yeah, I'll link it in the show notes. The one that you gave, it's free. You don't have to like do the annoying registering things.
Right. So. And if you're in therapy too, I think it's a great thing to bring into therapy and talk to a therapist about, because at the time I had a therapist who was really great, and I was like reading lots of books on psychology and then took this test and talked about my results with him, and it was fun to unpack and then look at like relationships that didn't work out and then the stories I was telling myself about it, and then look at how that related to personality traits, and just looking at yourself with a little more self-understanding and self-compassion, and then understanding, okay, well, if this is what I want out of life, and I know these are the base traits that I'm working with, that they're not super changeable, but I can change some of my choices and circumstances that will interface with my personality better. Or even like, I'm in the wrong career. I'm highly extroverted, but I'm working a desk job where I don't interact with anybody at all. Okay, well, maybe I should make a career move that involves working with other people more. Maybe I shouldn't be this. I should be like a tour guide or something. Yeah. Those kind of career shifts, I think, can like significantly improve things like your experience of loneliness or depression or whatever, just by working with your personality, rather than, thinking there's something wrong with you. It's like, no, I'm not leaning into my innate wiring.
Yeah, there's like I'm gonna botch the quote, but you've probably heard this before. There's something I've seen where they talk about like it's like they call the man stupid because he can't fish or something like that, but it's like it's something along those lines of like, even though he can't do that, it's like, but he's the woodworker trying to fish, like that kind of thing. It's like something along those lines. There's like a cartoon for it. It's way more eloquent than whatever I'm trying to say. But it's basically like, if you take the man that can't fish there, or it's like, it's a better, like, closer analogy where it's a guy that has something else to do with fishing. That's something, but it's like you keep trying to teach the woodworker to fish, but like the fisherman can't woodwork either. Right. And it's like, we're not calling, but he's not stupid. It's like that kind of concept of like, I think a lot of times it's very easy to get down on people who are like, or on yourself when you're like maybe not succeeding in a certain thing, or if you found a lot of things you're not succeeding in, but maybe everything you're trying is in, like, to your point, this like one lane of stuff that just doesn't suit you. And being able to find your thing, right? Like, I think there's very few, maybe not hot take, there's maybe very few people in the world that are actually unintelligent, and most people that just haven't found their area of intelligence.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people who maybe don't have the highest IQ, but could be very good at something specific if you got them into something that leaned into their strengths. Yeah. I mean, I do think there are some people that are pretty unintelligent, for sure, by many measures of intelligence. But again, like there could be a purpose for everybody. There's a something for everybody that they could find purpose in. I don't mean like we should put people into a purpose useful, but I mean, in my hometown, like we had a thrift store where they employed a lot of people with disabilities, and it was really cool that it was a certain tasks that they could do that were like good fits for them, and it met their capabilities, and that's kind of like how I think better communities should run. Is like, hey, let's work with people and figure out where they fit. There's a really good book I read when I was a few years ago, I was trying to get out of a deep depression, and this book called Lost Connections by Johann Hari really opened up my mind to how like depression and anxiety could be viewed as a signal that maybe something needs to change, rather than being viewed as just this random thing that happens because you have a chemical imbalance.
Yeah.
And I know that line, like, no medical professional worth their salt should have ever been taught that, like, oh, you just have an imbalance in your chemicals and that's the only explanation. But for some reason that messaging got to me when I was younger, and they're like, oh, you're prone to depression, so you just have like a lower baseline of happiness on average or something. And that I don't know if anybody intended for me to think of it that way, but that's kind of how I did think about it for a lot of years. And then I read this book and it talked about all these sources of connection, like connection being the opposite of depression, to life, like meaningful work, time spent in nature, meaningful relationships, blanking on all the rest of them. But they really helped me kind of reboot my understanding of how to find a better existence in life, and just looking for those like authentic sources of inspiration where I could do something meaningful or do something I'm good at, or something that at least at the bare minimum gives me less anxiety than what I had been doing in the future, or something that where I could do and I felt more authentic and true to myself. Like I couldn't work a sales job. I'd spent like 3 months trying to do sales at this company, and I just felt so bad about it and inauthentic. But then when I shifted to a product manager position where I was more working with internal teams and helping solve problems, but not being on the line, like cold calling people, suddenly I felt so much better. It was a small shift, but it made a huge difference. I just rambled for like 5 minutes.
No, that's totally fine. I think that makes sense. Like, I find it to be something like that both takes on that are useful, because it's like, sure, maybe the thing is like there is something like chemically, or you are more prone to these things, and that means you're somebody who has to like utilize those ways to pull out of it more than someone else would. But I like the idea of like, you do, like you said, like the signaling, like you need more of this stuff to not feel that way. But there are people obviously that like they don't do any of those things and they don't have those thought spirals, right? Like, so it's like, I think there is probably maybe like a predisposition to those types of thoughts and feelings, but like that there's things that you can definitely do, like rather than just like what you were saying, I think is the dangers of like stuff I used to talk about even in fitness coaching, right? It's like, on a loose analogy, we have a special guest per usual, Tonks is here. Like there is a let's say fitness wise, things that are like people, what is it fine?
No, it's all fucked up.
Okay.
You gotta come on.
She does this. Oh, it started focusing on her probably. Yeah. Is it good?
Yeah.
Like in fitness, just like on a very general basis, people who like have been like, okay, well, I'm genetically predisposed to being like overweight or like whatever it is. And so what that leads to is kind of like that self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like, so then they don't do anything to work against it or any of those things because they just assume it's harder for them. And it might be harder for them, but it doesn't mean it's impossible to find that like healthier place to be in. And I think that's kind of like the biggest parallel I could draw in terms of like relatability to someone to hear that on the outside, I guess, is like, you know, you may be someone that it is harder to find that baseline happiness, but there are steps you can do to make yourself like generally in a better mood most of the time.
I agree totally. Sort of like relating back to the neuroticism scale. Yeah, I'm definitely somebody that's more prone to like overthinking social situations and having regrets about saying something stupid or whatever. So knowing that about myself is helpful, and maybe that really is closer to what the message I got originally, which is like, oh, you just have different chemicals. It's like, well, maybe my personality is geared so that I'm more prone to negative thought spirals or something. So yeah, again, yeah, exactly what you're saying. Like knowing where you stand, how can I navigate the world in a different way?
Yeah.
That is less likely to trigger these like anxieties and stuff.
Yeah. I think that when you said like knowing yourself can be useful, it's like, I wanted to use that as a segue too, because I had a question for you I thought of before the podcast, both from like your maybe psych discussions you've had. I don't know if like there's stuff that you guys have gotten into this with like your degree and everything, but also just your personal opinion. How much do you feel like this test, really any kind of personality testing, has like how much margin of error do you think there is in the fact that like a lot of like the self-awareness you have to have like while you're taking the test? Because I always think about that, and maybe that's like something I overthink, but like when you're taking it, if you're someone who's like, some of those questions, I know people like have a view of themselves that may not be how they actually interact or how they actually are. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like, is there like a discussed kind of margin of error with that, or is that something that you have thought about?
I don't know. I don't know too much. I do know that the test I took, it said like, don't try not to overthink these, just try to answer them without thinking too deeply about it. So I do think they try to gear the questions to be pretty decent, and they ask the same questions in different ways. They ask the same questions in different ways so that you can kind of get an average. But yeah, that's valid, and it's probably worth people taking a few times over a few years. I don't think you want to take it too close together, but
Yeah. I just think like I've gotten into conversations recently with people at like comedy stuff, just talking about like how a lot of the population does tend to struggle, I think, with having like true self-awareness.
yeah.
And it's something I've seen show up in a lot of like personal relationships, obviously, in the theme of like, you know, with the podcast talking about like dating and things like that. I would just I would like to know, I guess, how someone whose brain isn't as neurotic maybe takes that test differently. Do you know what I mean? Because like for me personally, some of the questions about like, which probably I guess was the answer in and of itself, but some of the questions about like, do you think you're like this type of person, or like, I forget what it was exactly, but there were things like, do you think you're like a likable person or an enjoyable person? Like, you know, I forget what the word was, but basically like asking you to like say something good about yourself.
Yeah.
And it's like, I had this like dilemma in answering it, because I was like, I like on one, like, I know that I am, but then I'm like, how do I tend to feel about myself? And I was like, the fact that I probably even had to like go that like back and forth to answer is probably the answer, I guess.
That'd be funny if the test like knew how many times you changed your answer and they added that to your neuroticism score.
I think so, because there I noticed it like brought me back quite. Do you know if this is a test where like based on your answers they ask different things, or no?
I'm not sure.
Because you know some do that, right? Like they'll like filter that. Because so earlier in the test it had asked me something about like, do I like trust others easily, or like do I have trust in people? And like I had to kind of process that too, because I'm like, I kind of have a general like, I think people are going to hurt me kind of mentality. So I wanted to say no, but then I was like, okay, but I also tend to like very easily like open up and let people into my life hoping for the best. So I was kind of like, yes. So I went with like the like moderately accurate answer. And then later it asked me like, you don't trust people. And then I was like, accurate. Like, and so then this thing was probably like, what? But maybe that did contribute to that score.
I'm not sure how the one you took is set up. I think that may be the case on some online portals where if you answered two different questions on the same trait in different ways, it's like, all right, let's send a follow-up asked in a different way.
Yeah.
The inverse that's easier to be true to or something. That's helpful.
Because there was an option always too that was like neither. Like you're not necessarily saying it's inaccurate or that, and nor, and I found myself clicking that on a few things, and then I would find that maybe those topics were the ones that brought a different question, like similar. So maybe it is trying to keep you from just clicking through the whole thing, being like, I'm neutral and all of this stuff. But I thought that was funny because actually, like until we were conversing about it out loud, I didn't really think about how actually my like debate on those answers might have been actually like contributing to the result, which is kind of funny because I'm like, if someone who is not like deeply overthinks themselves or like who they are, like their self-worth or like where their place is, maybe would just have not even really second thought those answers. Just like, yes, I do. No, I don't. Yes, I see myself this way. So that's kind of funny.
Probably why it's best to, if you're taking this kind of test to understand yourself, why it's good to have somebody else to talk about it with, like a therapist, for example, because they will be able to suss out like where maybe your true personality varies a little bit from your results.
Yeah.
But very useful. So I recommend everybody take it.
For sure. I'll link it. To kind of tie this into like the themes of the podcast and stuff too, to whatever degree you're comfortable with. I'm very open on here about my shit, so I don't care. And like just how we've gotten to know each other pretty closely, you know, over the months we've been doing this, like from those results, where do you see some of those things show up in romantic relationships, like for either one of us really, or like things that we've kind of talked about?
That's a good question. I feel like the neuroticism has been my own worst enemy in a lot of relationships, and I get very hard on myself and like worry about saying the wrong thing, which just takes away from intimacy and bonding with people, because if you're in your head worrying about what to say, you're not being honest and authentic, and then that person is maybe going to see a worse version of you or a false version of you.
Yeah.
So in the past, probably worse in the past than it is now. But yeah, I definitely was a very nervous person and prone to like overthinking text messages, being like, oh, they took too long to respond. What does that mean? So that definitely surfaces. But in some ways, like, I'm highly high in openness and agreeableness. So usually like super open to date ideas and being like, I once had a first date on a boat with this guy years ago. He was actually living on a boat at the time and invited me to like go out on a boat. And so instead of my neuroticism being like stranger danger, like you could die out on a boat, I was like, that sounds awesome. I'm totally open to it. And it ended up being like a really fun first date. So
That's cool.
yeah, does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, I think like I relate to that a lot. I think when I was thinking about my answer to the question, like the neuroticism side of things definitely has shown up for me a lot as well as an enemy. And I was thinking about it in terms of like when relationships are ending, like that's something I think more people that probably rank higher in that have probably a harder time not internalizing outcomes of things rather than being able to look at, right, like this person, this says more about like just like what they're looking for, or like this is just not the right person for me, and instead like going down this spiral of like what is wrong with me, like what did I do wrong. And I've opened, I've talked about this extensively on the podcast. I was with somebody who very clearly was like a very unhealthy, toxic person, did a lot of very bad things to me, and I still remember initially, until working through more therapy on it, that like I was still convinced that like I had ruined the whole thing, like there was something I could have done to fix it, like, that kind of thing. So I definitely see that show up a lot in terms of, and then that tends to affect how you go into the next relationship, right? Because then you have those anxieties of like, I don't want to ruin it again. So you're more reserved or whatever else. And it's definitely an area that I feel for both of us, there's been growth in, but it's still something that shows up. And relatably too, when you mentioned like agreeableness or maybe that openness, I've seen that like be a good thing, but also be an enemy for me. Like, I think that, I have the whole, I have like a joke and all that stuff about attracting or like liking sad boys and stuff like that. But I do think there's a level of like, a lot of the questions that we're asking about like empathy and sympathy and things like that, that whenever somebody else has these like bad things in their lives or bad traits or bad, like, especially like bad, like background of trauma or things like that, that have made them behave the way they are, I'm more likely to just like tolerate being mistreated for longer periods of time because I'm like understanding of like where their pain comes from and why they're behaving, and then taking my own self and being like, oh, well, this stuff has affected how I move forward, but I'm trying to work through it. And then like assuming other people will do that same thing when they're not.
All of these traits can be they can work in your favor and against your favor. If you're too agreeable, or if you have too much empathy or sympathy for people, you could maybe let them walk all over you and not set good enough boundaries for yourself and stay in bad relationships, and not stand up for yourself and take an act of compassion for yourself instead of others. But if you're too disagreeable, then you might miss out on what could become a really cool relationship because you're like, nah, this guy sucks or whatever, too quickly. So, in some ways it can work in your favor against you.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we've had lots of the responsibly side of the podcast combos, which is always fun. And like I said, one of my favorite things about you and like meeting you is that there's a lot of times that we're like just bullshitting about stuff that's not important at all. And you're very funny and like very able to like riff and have like comedic value, and we roast each other and like, all of those things. But there's also like that balance of being able to be like a very intelligent and like emotionally sound person to talk to you about a lot of stuff too. And that's kind of like my whole basis of this podcast is like navigating life through like fun and chaos, but also being able to kind of like reflect on like, okay, here's what these experiences have like done and taught me. And that's like what I wanted this podcast to be, right? It's like some episodes are very like full of bullshit and we're all just talking about our chaos, but a lot of times there's a balance of like, okay, and then here's where we've grown and like what we have learned from that. So I feel like we've had a lot of good discussion in that realm, but I always like to leave everybody on an unhinged note. So I ask every guest I have what the most unhinged story they have is. Typically it's in the realm of like sex and or dating, the pursuit of romantic or sexual interests, or one that you've had. So I gave you a little warning. Sometimes people don't get one. But what do you got for us?
The first thing that came to mind was this really unhinged chapter of my life where I had just moved to Chicago. Two of my parents were going through their second divorce. So both my parents got remarried, and then one of the pairs got divorced. And I moved to Chicago, kind of like dealing with that from afar and trying to reinvent myself in a new city. I only had a few friends there, And like my 4th day in the city, I went on a date with a guy and was instantly smitten. And he said he said a lot of things that he was just like this larger than life character who knew all these important people and like owned his own place in a really cool neighborhood. And so I was just kind of like smitten, and he seemed to like me quite a bit. And so I was kind of trying to play it cool, but I was really excited about it. And then like a few weeks in, the communication started pulling off. And because I kind of have a history of having like an anxious attachment style, when someone pulls away, I get really crazy and I'm just like overthinking everything, being like, did I say something wrong or whatever? And it got to a point where like when he would ask me to hang out, it would always be like late at night after he'd been drinking. And I treated myself so poorly at the time because I should have just been like, no, I want to go on a date. I don't want to be your like late night snack. But there I was again. Every time he would text me, I would hop on the red line and book it to his place.
There's something kind of sexy about having to like take a train to something. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Justine used to live at all these metro places too, but for me, I'm like, oh, you took the train for
Well, it was just the CTA, so it wasn't. And the red line,
I'm picturing like the 50s train. You're like in a beret, like looking at the
I
know it's like the
where
next
all the
public
homeless people live because it doesn't shut down.
Yeah, just got like an old-timey briefcase and a cane.
That's what I envision.
I've got a monocle.
It's black and white.
I'm going to see my lover down on Claiborne or whatever it's called. Yeah, but at some point he did something weird where he said he like gave me a key to his place. He said something like, oh, you could, I'm going on a trip, you can use my place while I'm gone. And I was like, what? Like I can't even pin you down for a date and you're gonna give me a key to your apartment.
Right.
He's like, no, I would. And because I was starting to get fed up with what I thought were like lies or whatever, like drunken lies, I was like, then give me the key. And so he gave me a key to his place. And I think it was a few months later, I was at a party downtown and had way too many drinks. And I decided to go to his house and try to get into it. But thing is, he gave me a key to his unit in the building and not a key to the front door. And so I like stood outside for a while being like, maybe if somebody comes out, I could go inside. And I didn't actually think it through, like what would happen. Like, am I really just gonna barge into this guy's apartment? I think
this wasn't while he was out of town.
He was in town.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think I had texted him or something, but so it wouldn't have been a completely random thing. But luckily eventually I just like went home. But when I sobered up the next day, I was like, you were really just gonna walk into this man's house? Like what comes next? Like, well, you gave me a key to your place.
Yeah.
Like,
I'd swing by.
To be fair, it is pretty unhinged to give somebody a key to your place that you won't even like go on a date with. But
like it wasn't to like watch his cat. Like
I think I allowed myself to be dragged down to that level of unhingedness and was kind of playing the part. So I definitely am long past that level of self-disrespect, I guess I'll call it.
Yeah. There's something dangerous about, like, dangerous feels like a crazy word to use, but like about giving someone who's anxiously attached that you're not giving what they need to, and then giving them some level of like power like that. I think about, I have not talked about this like scenario in depth on here, but I was like seeing this guy in college and it was like on and off for a long time. And it was something where like I was repetitively becoming like the other woman, which like I've talked about loosely on here, being like, not something I'm proud of, but I got involved in. And I didn't know at first. And then I did know, and it was kind of this back and forth thing, right? But one of the first things that happened when I found out, I didn't confront him yet that I knew. And he did something like that where like I stayed there. He didn't know that I knew. And he like left for work, but he was like, I'm going to be back in like a couple hours. He's like, you can just stay like in my bed, like watch TV and, do whatever. And I'll be back later if you want to like make food or something. Right. And so I like had no desire to hang out in this guy's house until then. Like, what was I going to do? But he left and my brain was just like, this is a time where I can figure shit out. And I like went through this man's shit. Like I found this like notebook that was like, turns out the girl he was seeing had like written him this like basically journal of letters.
Oh my God.
And I read them all. and
Wow.
used it as like intel, because basically this, in hindsight, like it's so terrible because this girl was clearly very insecure about the relationship, as she had every right to be, obviously. But like the letter was just all these areas of like her insecurity and like what she feels like she's not getting in the relationship, and like what she feels like are like problems between them and all this stuff. And I like found myself like utilizing that over the next few weeks, instead of deciding to confront him like I wanted to try to like fit this character of the things that she wasn't able to be. And like I was just like started like trying to fill all of this stuff and being like, oh well, because she like had these insecurities about like their vanilla sex and all this stuff. So then I felt like I would like come over and like be like, I'm in lingerie, and like trying to do all this stuff. Like, and this is like I'm 21 years old when this is happening, and I'm almost a decade older than that.
You're
now.
like looking through all the things she's liked, and you're like, oh, I'm gonna buy that perfume.
Yeah, like literally the things that like she says are issues. And it was instead of like now like reading that, like I'm just in such a better place now, even though I've inarguably went through worse shit since then, but maybe that's why, is like I would have looked at that then and just been like so sad for this person who's like putting this all out there to like be like, I want to work through these things and here's my insecurities, and that this person is like still doing this, like that now would be this immediate just like, oh fuck this, like, you know what I mean? And like, and instead I basically just like used this girl's insecurities for my own gain. And it's like it's like one of my most like probably unhinged shameful feelings, is like really everything that had to do with that. But I think about how much that is drawn from like that anxious style of just like desperation of holding on to something that's unhealthy, that's not like, I had all these rationalizations, and like this guy behaved in a way that was definitely like he was playing us both for sure. And like when I did end up like confronting it, and ended up confronting her and telling her everything. I'd like written this letter to her before I moved away to Nashville. And this, like I said, I was back like in college. And when I wrote the letter, I redrafted it like so many times. And part of the letter was just like, hey, I'm probably like, it's totally understandable if you hate me. I would hate me. I kind of do hate me, like, you know, but like, I don't want this to be where it's like either one of us coming against each other, but like, here's like, we both just like fell in love with a bad guy. Like, and, you know, being like, there's, you know, at the end of the day, we were both being played, and like, I accept my role in this, but like, if I were you, I would want to know. And I'm sorry that I didn't have that realization like X amount of time ago. Right. And so it was something I needed to get out. And I mean, hey, they still got married and have fucking kids now.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. And it went on for years. Like, and so, and I like had let her know, I was like, I have like receipts basically. Like, I was like, I have like, you know, cause I was like, I could easily just sound like some psycho, I realized. So I was like, you know, I have, if you want it, like I didn't throw all that shit out. I was like, gonna like throw at stuff that was gonna hurt her. But I'm like, if you want like proof of this, like for you, I was like, I knew that they were engaged, actually, is what happened. Like we had stopped seeing each other, but it was just like sitting with me. So like I felt like I couldn't have my fresh start without like getting it out. And I was like, hey, if I were about to get married, I would want to know this. Yeah. And so I like just did it. She literally never interacted with me about it, which is crazy. I know she definitely got it because he reached out, obviously pissed. But yeah, it's crazy to me but that's, you know, I still just like feel this like sadness, because I'm like, you know, who knows, maybe now they've evolved and figured it out. But I'm like, I just think about that person, like the notebook I read, and then I think about that person that got that information and still decided to give this person a chance. And I'm like, there's probably so much more parallels with how her and I are internally than I like was willing to admit then. And then that actually makes me sad, because it tends to be people who are like him or other partners I've had. There's a tendency to like take advantage of people who are like that. Yeah. Right. And so I can like just see all that now with that like bird's eye view, that in the time it was just like this fucking chaotic, like bad thing. So yeah, every time I have people share their stuff, I always feel like I have to add a story to be like, okay, here's my problem.
Yeah. Well, on the topic of snooping and discovering things, I had a much lesser experience of that, but I was dating a guy for a while who I knew that he'd remained friends with his ex that he was like gonna marry, and before they called it off. And I remember him mentioning that they still hung out occasionally. And so I got suspicious, and I was like, I wonder, we'd only been dating for a few months, but I remember one time we were out hanging out like in like a big social event, and I think his phone was left unlocked because it was running the music. Mm-hmm. And at some point I had this really guilty moment where I was kind of left alone with his phone, and I didn't have to unlock it or anything. I just like snooped a little bit. I think his text messages might have even still been open, and I popped it open, and the last person that he'd been texting was his ex. And the last few things that they'd said in the conversation was like, thanks for last night. Yeah, it was good to see you. And there was like something was loved, or there was a winky emoji or something. And yeah, I was just like, he also shared his location with me while we were
Mm.
seeing each other. He just shared it indefinitely at one
Yeah.
time and then never took it off. And I remember snooping and looking at a few times, and he was at his ex's place.
Yeah.
And so I just, having known that, I wanted to confirm my suspicions that they were like still hooking up. And I guess the snooping is unhinged, but maybe the more unhinged thing is that like I didn't confront him
Yeah.
about it.
I was
I
just
was just like, oh well, we've only been seeing each other for a little bit. I guess I get it. Modern Greg would be like, hey, like before snooping on his phone,
Yeah.
I'd be like, hey, I just want to clarify, no judgment, but like if you're still involved with your ex, that's probably a boundary for me.
Mhm.
At the time, I thought I wanted to explore open relationships, so I was like, yeah, you can see, like we can still, see other people or something. But the one person I would not have been okay with him
Would be the
seeing
ex.
was a person that he was about to marry
Yeah.
a few months prior.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was a good example of where I learned about boundary setting and
Yeah.
how to navigate that stuff better.
Yeah, that's something I was gonna comment on too, is like I always hate like sharing stories about doing those things. I think it's very easy to like put people in a category of like that's like a crazy thing to do. But like realistically, I'm not somebody who like when I'm just dating you and I'm like feeling anxious or like on my own or like I'm just like having nerves, I'm not like somebody who's gonna like be trying to go through your phone or doing those kind of things. Like in this scenario, I'm like quite literally I knew this guy was like cheating on his girlfriend with me. And it's like, in that scenario, you're like, you had evidence, this person's telling you they're hanging out with your ex. And again, does it rationalize like going through that? I'm glad you brought up. So I was going to say is the better thing for me to do have been like, not do that and just been like, hey, I know you have a girlfriend and I'm not doing this, right? Or like having this boundary instead of trying to like play this detective work and then, especially go down the rabbit hole I did, or like you said, trying to like rationalize in your brain, like, oh, well, it's okay. We're not serious or whatever. So yeah, it's nice to look at like how you would handle it now versus then and knowing that's different is a good feeling.
Now it's just more like, okay, what's the conversation that we need to have earlier on to preempt that kind of dark pattern that forms when you're not speaking to the elephant in the room, or you're being willfully ignorant about stuff.
Yeah, I think that's huge too, because that's something that like took me a long time to have like a bravery or a confidence to do, and it's still something I'm working through and have gotten a lot better at. But it's like that is hard to do, but it's so much healthier to just have that conversation like, hey, these feelings are coming up for me and I want to check in, and it says, as something like, with the most recent thing I was involved in, like I brought that up and it sucks because there's this fear that you're not on the same page, and then when you're not, it means that thing might end, but that's like good, like it should end if you're not on the same page. And I think when you have that like anxious attachment, it's very hard to like you would rather just like stay in this anxiety spiral than like have something end, even though you were like, that's the thing making you feel terrible. So I think it's tough because like so far I haven't had data of like that I can internalize as like good, because it's like, oh, I have these conversations like twice in a row now in relationships where I've done it and then it ends. But I'm trying to like flip that script, or like that actually is good data because it's like opening that space for somebody that is going to work out with.
It just shows us how much we were wounded at some point that we're like, no, I'm afraid to ask what the state of things are because that might cause it to end. And it's like, if asking what the state of things is causes it to end, then you're not in a healthy relationship.
Period.
It's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
So like just like you said, sorry to mansplain. It's like,
no, that's
good data.
Recap. Yeah. That's a perfect recap of that. And I think that we definitely have talked a lot about that and could have probably done a whole episode on like attachment stuff. I had Hannah Deindorfer on early in the podcast and we spent a lot of time on that. So I'm glad that we went like a direction of like something we haven't went to with like the personality testings. But I think all of that lens, like you said, I'm sure most anxiously attached people probably score higher on neuroticism if I had to guess.
Yeah.
So
although I will say avoidant, I've been reading a lot about avoidant attachment styles because I think in the past I've dated several people that were avoidance, and avoidance tend to attract anxious.
Yes.
And just trying to read that, and I think avoidant people can also be pretty neurotic, but it manifests as like withdrawal, like they want to withdraw from the situation because they can't deal with it or whatever. Right. Where I'm like, no, I want to get in there with my incisors and like,
figure it out. Yeah. I've been I think I talked about this when Hannah was on, but I've been over the last couple of years reassessed, I guess for lack of a better word, I don't know if diagnosed is the right word, but in therapy as disorganized instead, which has been interesting. But I found that to be more of like it tends to keep me like with a more of a guard initially than I used to have, I think is why. Cause I used to just be very anxious, like dive right in and then just anxiously assess everything. And now she kind of explained it to me. It's been like 2 years now, so I don't really remember exactly, but basically like seeking out different situations where I can't be intimate with people, like, or purposely looking at people who are unavailable and like pursuing them. She was like, that's actually a mechanism of being avoidant, which I thought was interesting.
That is interesting.
But like basically that was like a form of avoiding action, because it was basically like the conversation that we had. I think you and I talked about this, but like something she brought up to me in therapy. So she was like, you attract emotionally unavoiding people because you're actually the one that's emotionally unavailable.
That's so interesting. Yeah, it's like, oh, I'm gonna date somebody who I know I couldn't really end up with because it's a safe bet.
Yeah, because we talked a lot about that like background I have and like ending up in these scenarios, like just what I just talked about. Someone who's literally seeing someone else, or someone who has like told me on day one, like I'm not looking for a relationship, and then like pursuing that. And she was like, there's a level of that like if you actually wanted or and were ready to be in like a secure, happy relationship, that you wouldn't be doing that. Like that would be an immediate like no, even. And she's like, that's not just being anxious, that's actually like your fears of that. And she's like, a lot of that stems from like when I have opened up that door before and then it ended so tragically. And so she's like, that's a defense mechanism where you're like, I'm actually not ready, because if I have something good again, it could have that bad crash again.
Right.
And that's like a kind of what you always talk about, your brain trying to protect you.
Yeah.
But that was a big like, holy shit, I have to really like work through that and process that at a moment.
It's so much work trying to become less unwell.
Yeah.
Speaking of less unwell, how are we doing on time? And did you get any questions?
Yeah. I think
We're at 18 minutes on this.
perfect. Let's see. I don't think we had a lot of questions, honestly. I had them. Oh, we got a really ridiculous question. Not ridiculous if you ask this. I don't mean this in a rude way, but I was unexpecting of it. So I'm gonna have you do this one, because the only other one someone asked about, like, are you political? And I don't really. I feel like that's like a long rabbit hole.
That is a rabbit hole, but I could,
yeah, if you want. But for the sake of time, we'll see where we're at. I think this is just a funnier one, and I would also like to know your take on that. So I had sent you this one.
Oh yeah.
So someone submitted, and this was to, I believe, whenever you had shared it. So this might be someone who follows you. Said that they had a lady. So this is coming from a man. A lady break things off after she told me we do not have sexual chemistry. We never had sex. We went on a couple dates. However, she did give me a hand job. Is this her way of saying, is her saying we have no sexual chemistry just a nice way of telling me I have a small dick, or am I being paranoid? I guess, to be honest, that could have come to either one of us, by asking for a girl's perspective, but I don't know. I don't think there's any way to have like an expert answer on that, but
yeah, probably impossible to know. But I think sexual chemistry does not all come down to the size of your penis.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot more factors than that.
My perspective on that, if I am like really thinking about it, because I've had people that like, I think sometimes you can just like have kissed someone and feel like you may not have sexual chemistry. So like if I had to like zoom out without knowing anything about you or this dynamic you had with someone, like maybe what she wasn't feeling is like when you guys were hooking up, even in that level, I assume if you're giving her a hand job, you guys probably like kissed and stuff, right? So that she just maybe didn't feel that kind of like lustful feeling. Or like it didn't have that kind of like chemistry of just like, because I think sexual chemistry to me has less to do with like pleasure and more to do with like ease with someone, honestly. Like if it feels like you just like mesh really well and like connect and things feel fluid, you feel comfortable being able to like navigate, because sex is a vulnerable thing. And like I think whenever something feels like comfortable and exciting and like all of that in one, that's like what I consider good sexual chemistry. And so for me, like my perspective of this being like a male-female situation is maybe like doing those things, because like again, she's not really getting any input on like how you perform sexually from giving you a hand job,
right?
So like to me that was probably like less about your dick size, if I had to guess, and more probably about like while she was in these heated moments with you, she maybe just didn't feel that like reciprocated like I want to go further energy.
Yeah, I think you gave a really excellent answer to a question that I think seems like it might have been a joke question.
But hey, some people may have had that same paranoia.
Maybe. Well, I say that because I think I know who submitted it.
Okay.
Which I'll tell you later.
That's funny. But well, I actually do think it's good to bring up though, because I had a guy that I did, one of the few people I've actually broken up with myself. I had told him that I didn't feel like we had like great romantic or sexual chemistry. And he was kind of like, oh, I feel like we had a lot of fun in those settings, or like that was good. And it's just that reminder of like me being like, yeah, it's not like none of those experiences were bad. Like, I mean, okay, well, there were some that were bad, but like, you know, it wasn't this overall me being like, oh, it was just like his dick or he was whatever, but it was more like, I just didn't have that like desire for this person, you know? So, even if that person was joking, maybe that was helpful to somebody out there.
So
Yeah, but that's really funny. That might be a joke, but yeah, I don't think newly we got anything else. That was from Carly's. Yeah, I think that was all we got.
cool.
You guys really slacked on the questions, but they did with Carly's too. We got an influx for her at the very end, but it was like the day we did it, so we didn't get to do much any of it on the podcast really. But yeah, that was fun. Do you have anything else you want to touch on or add before we go? Did you want to talk about politics?
No, not really. I mean,
I have another podcast.
Yeah, I used to make TikToks that would like try to comment on political happenings and stuff. I was always trying to look for the humor and the hypocrisy in both sides.
Yeah.
So I always try to identify as like independent or politically fluid.
Yeah.
Like, I'm always just looking for the joke, and I also deeply care about people and issues, and everything's always really complicated. So I'm always just like, I'm not trying to be in any of these tribes that people are forming, except the tribe that is seeking to actually understand things and find solutions to things, which is usually not one of the two major parties. So
Yeah,
that's all I'll really need to say about that.
Yeah, we've had a lot of conversations about that, about being like, I think a lot of things aren't super solution oriented, unfortunately, being the bigger problem is like, I think like at the end of the day, there's a lot of stuff that even if we don't have the exact same like black and white view on, that we're all looking for a common solution of how to like live in a better society together. But it tends to just be people being like, here's the issue, or here's the issue, instead of like, how can we fix that issue actively? It's like, so I think, you know, for a brief version, that's good. But
it's usually like, here, how can we say that we're fixing this issue, but actually make sure the issue persists until the election cycle is over, so that we can make sure we win. Oh, also now it's 4 years later and it's still not really fixed, so that we can win another election. Oh, 4 years later, it's still not really fixed. It's like this cycle on both sides for a lot of things. But then people always be like, well, one side is worse than the other. I'm like, yeah, at any given moment, probably, but the calculus required to do that calculation is so complex, and there's so many sub issues to everything, and that's just so exhausting. It's like, can we find something we agree on, and make that our focus, and not tear each other apart. So anyway,
it's a big complex world.
It is.
We're just floating on a rock out here.
That's right.
That's what I try to tell myself. But no, this was a lot of fun. I think we had a lot of really good conversations. Hopefully it was helpful to somebody.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate you and our friendship. Like you mentioned earlier, we can talk about funny things, and we can get really serious and nerd out about personality psychology for more than half an hour.
Yeah.
So thank you for having me on.
Yeah. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being a great friend. And for just being, hilarious and intelligent and incredibly sexy, obviously, look at that. But if you have anything you want to plug or anything you got going on, let them know here, and I can link anything you want, but I'll definitely put Greg's Instagram and TikTok in the show notes and that personality test for you guys.
Cool. Yeah. Just that. Instagram for now.
All right. Well, thanks, Greg. Thanks, everybody. And we'll see you next time.